Well, we are returning to the book of Ecclesiastes. We have gone through 2 chapters and part of the 3rd. And when we looked last time at the beginning of chapter 3, it was the famous passage that there's a time for all things. A time to be born, a time to die. And as I mentioned the old song by the 1960s group called The Byrds, who had a song on that. You can Google that if you want to. But the whole point is built upon the last part of chapter 2, where Solomon started to give a solution to the despair of life. Now, in the previous chapters, he had talked about how that I've tested life in so many ways, and it's a bad business. It's a sorry business. It's a difficult business that God has given us. And he talked about how that everything eventually is fleeting. And he's talking about pursuing things from an earthly perspective. Philosophy, trying to figure things out, working hard, toil, folly, just enjoyment. It's all self-defeating and fleeting in its enjoyment. But then in the end of chapter 2, he starts to give a solution to that by saying there's nothing better than for someone to enjoy their toil. Enjoy what God is giving them and to recognize it as a gift from God. And so then when we recognize that and then we enjoy the time we have, yes, we're going to die, which was a point of despair in the other earlier parts of Ecclesiastes because the man's worked so hard to build so much and then he's going to die and leave it to someone else and he's not going to have it anymore. And so he's been working so hard and just striving so much and losing sleep just to lose it. But the answer to that is recognize what we have is something God has given us. It's not something we've created. It's something God has given us. He has given it to us for our enjoyment. And we need to live and enjoy it at the time we have. And then there's no regret at turning it over. Then we give it to someone else. We don't have to leave it because our focus is not upon that. And then he went into chapter 3, which became a discussion of the times and seasons that were under the control of God. And there's a lot of times and seasons, and I won't go into the detail of it, but you can go back if you want to and watch the video and see what was said in that. But there's a time and a season for all things. And the idea behind that is that God is controlling these times and seasons. Now, after that, we come to this section we're going to look at today, which begins in verse 9 of chapter 3, in which Solomon's going to talk about this. He's going to return to the idea of toil. So it shows you that the end of chapter 2, where he was talking about toil and enjoying your work, is interrupted by this section upon understanding the times, and he's going to return back to the idea of toil with a different perspective. He says in verse 9, what gain has the worker from his toil? Now that's just the question he uses to set it up. Before, when he was looking at it from a selfish standpoint, it was like, well, he really doesn't have much. I mean, he works hard and he dies and leaves it to someone else, and they may be a fool and they may blow it in. So he says, what gain has the worker from his toil? Verse 10, I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. Now, he had used this term before, or this kind of phrasing, and he said it's a hard business before. He doesn't say that. He uses very similar language, but it's a different look at it. It's not that God has given a hard business for men. Well, if you understand it from a secular point of view and trying to get ahead in this life, yeah, it does look hard. But it's a different perspective here. God's in control of things. So he says, I've seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. Verse 11, he has made everything beautiful in its time. Okay. Now this picks up from what he has just talked about. The times and the seasons being in the control of God. And he says now, God's made everything beautiful in its time. And everything is appropriate in its time. It's under the control of God. And when we understand that, we can deal with the hard times. We can deal with the good times. We can deal with times of gain. We can deal with times of loss. We can deal with times of building and then times of tearing down, when we understand that God is in control of the times. And he's made everything beautiful in its time. And then he says this, also he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. Now that's a big statement here. First of all, he's speaking to the fact that human beings are eternal creatures. Now, I know it is our modern evolutionary, secularistic philosophy that we are just human animals, and as animals, we're just really biological machines, no more than a mechanical machine like a car might be. We just have a greater intelligence. That's the idea of the secularistic world, which makes no sense. It makes no sense whatsoever. It is the view of secularism, which is built upon the Enlightenment from the 17th century, which is still prevalent to now, which was an idea of elevating human reason above revelation of God and discounting any revelation of God, discounting God, really, and just making everything about man. So our modern secularism is just the coming of age of these philosophies that have been meandering around over the last few centuries. And the idea is that we're just human animals. But the scripture tells us that he has put eternity in our hearts. Now, if he has put eternity in our hearts, it also says that he's created us. But then that was the understanding of Solomon. No one really argued that in that day, that somehow man came into being by some divine method. So, but God has created us with eternity in our hearts. So there's more to us than just what happens in this life. Now that should give us a good perspective. And it should give us a different perspective. It's certainly not the perspective that Solomon mentions earlier in this book, where he's talking about, okay, I'm seeking wisdom, I'm seeking folly, I'm seeking accomplishment and self-indulgence. When we understand that God has created eternity in man's heart, then we say, oh, there is more to this than what I do in this life. And Solomon's going to bring that out, even though his focus in this book is living life in this world as it is. He does not forget the eternal aspects. In fact, the last 2 verses of the book of Ecclesiastes, he said, God will bring everything to judgment, and whether good or bad. So we have to understand that we do live under the sovereign direction of God. So he says God has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. Now here's Solomon, who is the wisest man who ever lived, saying, we can't figure it out. We cannot delve into the divine thought. We cannot understand the complexities and the majesty of what God is doing in the world. It's beyond our thinking. Now, this is an amazing admission by Solomon, because he's smarter than anybody. And he will even say it later in this book. He said, I have tried to find the scheme of things, and I couldn't find it. So maybe that should kind of tell us, if Solomon couldn't do it, we can't either. And so the idea then is to trust God. Because God's the one who put eternity in our hearts. God's the one who controls the times. And God's the one who's controlling things from beginning to end, and we cannot comprehend it. So therefore we must trust him. And so he says there in verse 12, and this is kind of the summation as a result of that, I perceived that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. If we're eternal creatures, if we're going to have a life past this life in some sense, and Solomon doesn't go into that, but we as Christians understand that. And if we cannot understand the times, we understand that they're controlled by God, and we don't understand what he's doing with the times, what do? Then we just be joyful in God and do good in our life. And when he says do good, he's not talking about good works to earn your salvation. He's talking about obeying God and living in accordance with God's ways. If God's controlling the time, if God's controlling our time, if he's put eternity in our hearts and yet he's given us these things as gifts, enjoy them. Do good. Recognize that there's an eternity that we are living for, even though we are living in this life. But God doesn't make this life without consequence. He wants us to enjoy it. It's good. It's the good life. It's not like, well, I'm just going to meander through and hope I can make it till I finally die and go to heaven. That's not what God desires. He desires us to enjoy our life and to see his blessing in it. So he said, I perceive there's nothing better for them than to be joyful and do good as long as they live. And then he says in verse 13, also that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. Now this is exactly what he was saying at the end of chapter 2, where he said, there's no hope in trying to work so hard and to get ahead and wasting your life and worrying about getting ahead. He said, just enjoy the life that God's given you. Enjoy the work God has given you. Enjoy the benefits and the rewards of that work that God has given you. It is his gift. And so he comes back with this renewed understanding of God controlling the times. He says, enjoy your life. Be joyful. Do good. Enjoy the gifts God has given you. What is so sad is that people who have worked so hard, and sometimes with the noble idea of I want to make things better for my family, that they spent so much time working that they never enjoyed their family, that they were supposedly working to make things better for. Solomon says, enjoy this life. All of these things we have, whether it be our jobs, our toil, our labor, the things God has allowed us to have as a result of our labor, the family he's allowed us to have, enjoy them. They are God's gift for this life. Don't disregard it. Understand God's in control of things. And he goes on to say in verse 14, I perceived that whatever God does endures forever. Now, once again, he's taking this thing to God's sovereign direction of all things. God's direction of our lives, God's direction of human history. It's not just our little lives that God is directing. Large things in history, worldwide, galactic things are being directed by the sovereignty of God. A bird doesn't fall to the ground without the direction of God, without the God being aware. The hairs of our head are numbered. The stars in the galaxies are numbered. He even says he calls them all by name. God's power, his knowledge, his resources are infinite. And so therefore everything he does endures forever, Solomon says. And we can trust in that. That's a good thing. If God was like man, everything we do, it eventually gets old and it perishes. It's eventually, we buy a car, eventually it wears out. We have to repair our house because it will wear out. This is the nature of human life. But he said, what God does endures forever. That's good news for me. And it should be for you too. And he says, nothing can be added to it, what God does. He said, I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done it. That's a comfort too, to know that what God has chosen to do, no man can change it. No man can say, I'm going to do better than that, or no man can say, I'm going to take away what God has done. And he says, God has done it so that people fear before him. The purpose of God's works is that we would glorify him. And when it says fear, it literally does mean we fearfully respect him. We acknowledge his power. We acknowledge that he is God and we are not. And we say, well, of course we acknowledge he's God and we are not. Well, a lot of people in this world do not. Because the whole idea behind secularism is that all it is us. And there's a lot of people who live that way. But he says, God has done all these things that we may fear him, that we may acknowledge him. And it's like the Westminster Shorter Catechism said, that God, the chief end or chief duty of man is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. Now Solomon could certainly have written that. Glorify God because he's controlling the times. He has given all these things that we may fear him and then enjoy the things that God has given. He says, verse 15, that which is has already been. He's already talked about that. That which is to be already has been. Now he talked about that where he said that, look, life has a cycle to it. Nothing is new. Everything repeats itself eventually. Ideas that people came up with, other people had these ideas many times before. So he said that which is, has been, that which will be, has been. And then he says at the end, God seeks what has been driven away. Now that's a weird phrase, and there's some disagreement among the commentators about it. But not a whole lot. Because that which is driven away is taken to be what the subject of all this is time. And so the idea behind it is that God seeks what's driven away. God can seek out that which is in past time and bring it to fruition. In other words, here's the way I took it. And let me just tell you my little interpretation of that. God can seek that in the past, which requires judgment, and he can bring it to be. He can seek that in the past that requires blessing, and he can bring it to be. There have been wicked things done in the past. And understand this, God knows it all. And God will bring things to judgment in his time. But understand this also, there's been faithfulness in the past. Maybe we were faithful in our past. We need to understand God remembers that. He does not forget our labor of love, the scripture says. He's not so unfaithful to forget that. And so God will bring blessing as he sees fit. But the whole idea behind this is that God is controlling our times. At the times of this world, the times of this earth. And he will cause it to work as he desires it to. And that should be a comfort to us. So, when we understand that, then we don't worry. We live in enjoyment of what God has given. We seek to live in accordance with God's ways and understand he will bring everything to pass as he sees fit. We as eternal beings owe everything we have to God, and we must acknowledge that. So this is a wonderful, wonderful passage. And if we get a hold of these ideas, it will bring comfort to us, even in our difficult and dark times, to know God's controlling the times we live in. And so, yes, there may be times of mourning, but then there will be times of rejoicing also. Well, may God bless you. And I hope this has been a blessing. And we will continue on next time. God bless you.